Welcome to Tigray Media. My name is Maliti Brahana Meskel. It has been 7 months since the war on Tigray began. Since then, more than 2 million people are internally displaced. More than 63,000 refugees have fled to Sudan before the border was blocked, preventing the flow. More than 150,000 civilians are estimated to have been killed. Western Tigray, a population of more than 1.5 million people, has been ethnically cleansed. Those people are gone off of their land. Farms have been burned, mango orchards have been chopped down. More than 5.2 million people, 91% of the population of Tigray, is at risk for starvation, which means they're at risk for death if the world does not respond. Factories have been burned down, hospitals have been looted, girls are being gang raped. The youngest victim on record is 4 years old. The oldest is 89 years old. We know that hospitals have been turned into what people are calling rape factories. Women are being tied down in beds and raped repeatedly. Women are being dragged by their hair in public after being raped by multiple soldiers. Hot rods have been inserted in women's bodies to mutilate and kill their reproductive organs. All of these combined create the conditions for a genocide. Today, there's a very special guest with us. He is one of the leading world-renowned humanitarians who called the genocide in Darfur and has been at the front lines witnessing the worst of humanity. Mr. Mukesh Kapila, we're really honored to have you today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Mr. Kapila, you had a front row seat in Rwanda, Darfur, Cambodia, Sierra Leone, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and so many more. No one is more qualified to talk about a genocide than you are. You've called the war on Tigray a war of annihilation. Can you tell us how you came to that conclusion?
Well, the pattern of atrocities that are now well documented, the rapes, the destruction of livelihoods, the massive displacement, the brutal forms of violence, and the denial of humanitarian assistance and medical assistance. When you put all those patterns together, they point towards a systematic strategy of annihilation. And now that can only be done by authorities with considerable capacities and resources at their disposal. Therefore, putting all these items together, I think what I'm sorry to conclude is, to me, quite clearly a modern genocide.
There's a hesitancy in the world to use the word genocide. It's like this magic word. And you said oftentimes it comes later. It comes when in history, when you're describing what has already occurred. Can you talk about that a little bit and talk about like some of the similarities you've seen? I have a great friend from Armenia who's been following the Tigray genocide, and he talks about the similarities. So can you talk about that and also talk about this magic word and why it's so difficult for the world to use the word genocide?
Well, to take your second point first, the reason governments are reluctant to use the word genocide, as well as the United Nations is reluctant to use the word genocide, is because the Genocide Convention then obliges whoever declares this to take some action. And because countries and the international community in general are very reluctant to act, or they do not have the capabilities to act, or they are calculating that if they were to act, it would make them vulnerable in other political areas. That's why people are reluctant to use that particular word. And I'm afraid, ever since the Genocide Convention came along in the 1940s, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, not a single genocide has ever been actually prevented. Because by the time the label is applied, and it is tested in a court of law, it has been analyzed by pathologists, archaeologists, forensic scientists, and God knows who else. But then, of course, the deed is done. The evidence that accumulates in order to justify a diagnosis by definition means that the genocide has already taken place. Coming to your first point, what has struck me as an unfortunate observer of genocides in all continents, in Rwanda, in Darfur, in Srebrenica, and in my travels in early genocides to places like Cambodia, is the remarkable similarities. In other words, it doesn't really matter whether you are using modern technologies to kill people, or you've been using ancient technologies, like it was the case in the case of Rwanda, or the more modern technologies that were used in Darfur, or the industrial style technologies that were used by the Nazis during the Holocaust. The processes are very similar. So the only difference between Armenia, Darfur, or anywhere else you like that we know about as a proven genocide is only the means by which the genocide is executed, not the stages of it, not the processes of it, not the different elements of it. And it always has the same elements. You kill people, you rape the women, you destroy their livelihoods, you force them away from their native places in such a way that it makes it impossible for them to ever return. That's why we call it the final solution. And that's why it's called ethnic cleansing in a complementary language.
And these are recognizable things, recognizable patterns. So it shouldn't be, it's not that you can't identify a genocide, it's that countries are afraid because then they have a responsibility to act. Is that accurate?
Yes, I mean, I think this is where there's this unfortunate problem with the word genocide, because by declaring a genocide, it is such a big thing you are saying that it has paradoxically a disempowering effect. It is just numbing of action, numbing of thought, numbing of mind. And as I say, by the time you have to take that step, the job is done. That's why I think when we talk about the situation going on in Tigray, very definitely these are acts of genocide, in my opinion, but they're also war crimes. They're also crimes against humanity. And it is a combination of those features, which incidentally all have the same effect. So we may apply the term genocide, or we may not, if, for example, it would help the world to act if we use some other terminology. But the impact is just the same. So very definitely, all the roads of crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, genocide, war crimes, violations of international humanitarian law, and criminal acts, you can use many forms of language, but they all coincide in one place, in space and time. That's why I call it annihilation, in an attempt to, in a sense, not get away from genocide, but in a sense to explain to a world that sometimes doesn't even understand what genocide is. They know the word, right, but because they glaze over when they hear the word. But I hope everyone can understand what annihilation means.
That's a great point. I want to read what Senator Menendez said, because I think there's a growing frustration about how we're talking about what's happening in Tigray. So there was a public hearing recently, and he said, and I quote, "We are acutely waiting for that determination because for many of us, we believe, in fact, these are war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I understand the concerns of such a designation, but we cannot turn blindly away when such things happen in the world. And I so look forward to the State Department determination, and I hope they will come to the right one." I thought that was really powerful because he said it in a public setting. He was very frustrated when he was saying it, and it's similar to what you're saying now.
Well, absolutely. But there are 2 points that I think deserve elaboration. Firstly, there is this kind of myth that has grown up over the last 70 years that a determination of genocide can only be made in a court of law. Well, yes, of course, in an ideal world, I mean, for example, if somebody got murdered on the street outside, the police would investigate. Hopefully, they will get the perpetrator, and then the perpetrator would make a defense as well. This is what rule of law is all about. And a legally constituted court of law would say whether or not the crime is proven against the individual so charged. That is right. However, nowhere does it in the Genocide Convention does it actually specify the legal process alone. Obviously, it talks about the International Court of Justice, which is good. We now have the International Criminal Court, and the Rome Statutes of the International Criminal Court are empowered, if you like, to make that determination. But the problem with the legal process as we know it, both domestically and internationally, is that somebody has to refer the crime to some authority. Now, so this way we can always say this is almost like a victimless crime, because in a sense nobody actually takes the alleged perpetrators to an authorized body that would actually do it. So we have a chicken and egg situation. And this is why we are in the ridiculous situation that 100 years later, we don't recognize the Armenian genocide, and yet I think the historical evidence is incontrovertible, that we have the Germans apologizing for what happened 120 years ago. The precursor to the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews in Europe in the 1940s was actually what happened in northwest part of southern Africa, i.e. what is now Namibia. And they actually tried out the methods of genocide there before they applied it in Europe. So you get my point. The thing is that the legal processes, so the International Criminal Court can't do anything because nobody has referred the matter. Now, either a state party has to refer it, meaning someone who signed up to the Rome Statutes which govern the International Criminal Court, or the matter has to be referred by the Security Council. So otherwise, the International Criminal Court can't do anything. So what happened in the case of the Rohingyas was that Gambia, a little African nation on the opposite corner of the world compared to where Myanmar is, took it upon itself to refer the situation of the Rohingya to the international, to the ICJ, International Court of Justice. Now here you are, as an example, of a country which had nothing to do with the situation, far, far away, in a group of people that probably most Gambians wouldn't be able to find, Myanmar on the map. They wouldn't be able to spell the word Rohingya, right? And yet they, affronted by the crimes against humanity that were taking there, exercise what is called universal jurisdiction. What that means is that when there are absolutely abhorrent international crimes being committed, of which genocide is one, and other crimes of humanity also exist, including mass rapes that you have mentioned, and other forms of cruelties that are very evident in Tigray now. Then what that means is that these become universal crimes, and they therefore fall under a growing body of law, which allows anyone in the world to be able to take anyone to court somewhere, and not necessarily connected with the place where the crime is being committed, because these are crimes of universal jurisdiction. So the law, I think the hopeful thing is that the law is evolving, that what was considered the conventional way of doing things a decade ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, doesn't mean to say that we are stuck in those times. So what we have to do now is to actually not be put off by these formalistic, traditional ways of investigating these matters and trying the criminals for it, and to actually look at creative ways of bringing justice. The other point I should make is, sorry, I'm going on, but please. No, the other point I want to make is that in criminal law, usually it is an individual who is charged. So when a murder takes place on the road outside, well, clearly you can't charge the whole of my village with murder. It has to be someone individual who is alleged to have committed the murder. Right. Now, this places us in a dilemma. We know that what is going on in Tigray is a mass organized strategy of elimination. It requires huge resources of the state, of two states, in this particular case, Ethiopia as well as Eritrea. The mobilization of soldiers on a massive scale, the mobilization of resources, of intelligence, of means of communication, of means of transport, of being able to inflict these brutalities on a systematic, organized, and continuous basis. So now, today's genocidaires, they're not that stupid. They don't sit there, they don't sit down and write memos saying, please commit genocide. So what we have to do is we have to impute from the pattern of violence that takes place what is happening. That is why if you look at what has happened in the case of Darfur, where I was very heavily involved, the International Criminal Court charged the then President al-Bashir of acts of genocide. Because you may be able to distinguish between acts of genocide and an overall genocide. So if, for example, hundreds of atrocities have taken place in Tigray, we know that, it is possible that some of those atrocities in place X or Y, Western or Eastern, Northern or Southern, may be defined as acts of genocide in those locations. So, and even determining that is in advance, rather than saying that just because we can't prove a certain leader in either Ethiopia or Eritrea is masterminding this, then we cannot bring a case of genocide. I don't know if I'm clear, but this is an extremely important point in terms of accountability and culpability of crimes. Otherwise, actually, genocide, this most massive of all crimes against humanity, people can get away scot-free.
Right. Right. Oh, you made so many good points there. So first of all, I think a lot of people will be surprised to know it was Gambia that referred what was happening in Myanmar to the ICJ. I think that's going to be some information that many of us missed, and that's really powerful. Who referred the issue in Darfur to the ICJ? Do you know which country?
Yeah, well, in the case of Darfur, I was United Nations chief in Sudan. And when I spoke up, apart from, I think, me having to leave the country because I was no longer welcome in Sudan, because of the fuss I had made, and because I was in a very senior symbolic position, I was the head of the United Nations in a country. So, therefore, when I spoke, it could not be brushed aside. I mean, you know, other human rights organizations can say, Amnesty can say many things, Human Rights Watch can say many things, and they are saying these things, and they are good people, and they need to be listened to. But they don't occupy any official authoritative position. It is their job to promote human rights and campaign against human wrongs. They are just NGOs. But when a person in authority speaks, then at least nominally someone has to take it reasonably. So what happened then in that case was that the Security Council, on the back of what I, as a senior UN official, was saying, the Secretary General at that time, Kofi Annan, who previously had been extremely silent on this issue, had no option. And the Security Council had to meet. They conducted an inquiry. They made an independent inquiry appointed by the Security Council, not a joint inquiry with the government of Sudan. It was an independent inquiry commissioned by the Security Council. And they referred the matter to the International Criminal Court. And in the statutes of the International Criminal Court, when a country which is not a party to the statutes refers, because Sudan is not a member of the International Criminal Court, if you like to see, but it doesn't have to be, because the Security Council referred to the ICC, and the ICC was under obligation that it had to investigate. There was no way it could not do so. And you know, one thing about justice is, at least credible justice in a country where there is still a rule of law or international, is that once the wheels of justice begin to grind, they're very difficult to stop. And though it took many years to bring President Bashir and his coterie to indictment, and there's at the moment a case going on, or one of the perpetrators who's there, the fact is that when that happens, then the process starts. In the case of Tigray and Ethiopia, of course, our problem is that the Security Council cannot refer because countries like China, in particular, and Russia are obstructive and will veto any referrals. The reason China and Russia did not veto the Security Council discussion and referral of Darfur to ICC during my time was for two reasons. One, Russia was in internal domestic turmoil because it was going through its own transition processes. And China was weak at that time, weaker than it is now. And of course, the Olympics were going to happen in Beijing. And many of us started a campaign against the Beijing Olympics. We said that if China obstructed the referral of Darfur situation to the International Criminal Court, then we would advocate for the Beijing Olympics to be called the Genocide Olympics. And the one thing that China didn't want in the proud moment to host the Olympics, this rising super for the first time in history, they didn't want the world to boycott it and didn't want to be called the Genocide Olympics. So they abstained. And that allowed the Security Council resolution to go ahead. Sorry to go into the details, but it's important you understand that the people of Ethiopia, of all sides, not just Tigrayans, and the people of Africa from all sides also understand that the geopolitics are very important in this. But it doesn't mean that the geopolitics should paralyze us. People need to find creative and constructive ways to move forward. And it is possible. If little Gambia can do it, and if the African Union can turn Mali out of the African Union, I can't see why the African Union cannot act on this. But as you know, they are the ones who are completely paralyzed because they're hosted in Addis. And of course, it's the most disgraceful conduct of any African institution that I've ever seen. And it shames all Africans, apart from it shaming all humanity.
Agreed, 100%. There is so much disappointment with the African Union's lack of stance on something that is so clear. There are there were 152 states who were signatories. Who do you think is the closest to being able to refer what's happening in Tigray to the international courts? Do you see someone sort of leading that, or what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think a very good question, and to be honest, I will need to think further about it. But
yeah, I think Ireland, they seem like they've been speaking a lot.
Well, I think Ireland would be a great country. The problem is that Ireland is part of the European Union. And one of the problems of the European Union, that great institution and great champion of human rights, generally, I would say, is that they move by consensus on these matters. So, and if you look at the conduct of individual European Union states, some have been very outspoken and they've done great things. Look at what Germany did in relation to the Syrians who came into Germany. But look at what Denmark is doing now in terms of its anti-humanitarian and anti-human rights behaviors. And this is the problem. In the way the United Nations Security Council is paralyzed for reasons of geopolitics, the European Union, by and large, member states with the right hearts, if you like, are paralyzed by the complicated processes. So unless Ireland or countries like that wish to go on their own, and there's no reason why they cannot, I'm afraid at the moment, the very weak and feeble diplomacy that is emanating out of Brussels is even worse than, it's certainly in no way keeping up coming to Washington, D.C., wherein lies our biggest hope.
Wow. You're dropping so many gems for us. I want to talk about the children. More than 6,000 children have been orphaned. That's just what we know of. maybe the number is higher, and it's quite possible it's higher. More than 720,000 are reportedly displaced. We know that women are giving birth in the streets. Children have been targeted for sexual violence, physical, mental abuse, hunger, malnutrition, displacement, lack of education. No one can go to school right now. Family separation. I mean, you describe the atrocities as having generational shifting powers. Like this could be generation shifting. I thought that was a really powerful statement. And most of us are focused on what's happening right now and trying to make it stop. So we're not thinking about the long-term impact. Can you talk about what you mean by generational shifting?
Yes, we see my study of genocidaires, and by the way, I have in my unfortunate witness life, actually not just witnessed genocides, but I've actually sat face to face with genocidaires as part of my diplomatic work. And this was the case, for example, when I met people like Milosevic in the former Yugoslavia, or of course President al-Bashir in Sudan. And I saw the genocidaires, in the immediate aftermath of the Rwanda genocide as they took refuge in Congo. One's got to understand that when a genocidal journey is started, then the logic is to complete it, okay? Because you can't have half a genocide. You can't, when you embark on a genocide, you can't take the risk of embarking on half a genocide. Right. Therefore, because if you leave the job half done, then you're extremely vulnerable. Because one, the job isn't done. Two, the survivors make your life even more difficult. And then you can see the geopolitical complications that come after that. So this is why what I mean to say is that what is going on in Tigray now is generations shifting, meaning annihilation and ethnic cleansing and destruction of the way of life and the culture of a people who called themselves as Tigrayans or however they describe themselves in that part of the country. And the logic is to complete, the logic on the part of the genocidaires or those who command them is to complete the journey. Okay, you get it. This is why I think all these calls for humanitarian ceasefire that are going on, all these tweets you are seeing every day of country after country saying we want a humanitarian ceasefire, misses the point. Of course there will be a humanitarian ceasefire sooner or later. But by the time the later happens, the job is done. The genocide is more or less complete. Now, my second point I wanted to say, you quoted some numbers. I think your numbers are gross underestimates. And the reason I say that is that if you study recent genocides, meaning in the last 20, 30 years, there are certain statistics which become almost like universal truths, almost like an equation. So if you look at what happened in Darfur, and as time went by, and from the refugees and others, we got more and more data and statistics together as the years passed, and we could consolidate historical data. It was very clear that somewhere in the region of 30 to 50% of the women were raped in Darfur. When you look at the situation in Rwanda, where the data are even more complete, a smaller country, and the refugees were more consolidated in neighboring Congo, and the figures, and then of course we had the AIDS epidemic in Rwanda afterwards, and from that we estimate that somewhere in the region of 1/3 to 1/2, closer to 1/2 people, Rwandan women, were actually raped. So when I heard USAID tweeting that 20,000 women were going to need treatment, I thought, I don't know where they get their figures from, but you can easily increase that number by at least tenfold. I would estimate if the law of genocides applies, and by the way, the same thing happened in Srebrenica, and I was very heavily involved in Bosnia during that. And roughly speaking, about a third of the women in the areas where Bosnian Serbs were doing the worst and the Serbs were doing the worst in Syria, they were raped. See? So if that law of 1/3 applies, then, and I'm sorry to say that the stories of brutality we are being reported from Tigray, not by one person, not by one journalist, but by channel after channel after channel after channel after channel, by journalist after journalist after journalist, by organization after organization after organization, none of whom have any vested interest in reporting any fake news. In fact, it's very inconvenient to report real news when Ethiopia can be such a powerful country. No journalist wants to report and then be exiled from Ethiopia. So what impresses me by that and the nature of the brutalities is that they are worse than anything that I encountered in Darfur. Situation in Tigray now, in 2021, is worse than the situation I saw with my own eyes in Darfur in 2003, 2004. The closest I can come to think of it is Rwanda, because in Rwanda things are pretty brutal. I mean, there really was brutal, and even now when I talk about Rwanda, I get a strange taste in my mouth because I was right there in the middle of the bloodlust at that time in 1994. So what I'm saying is, I don't think the statistics people are quoting are minimalistic statistics. Of course, it's better not to. No one should exaggerate. I'm not saying that, but I think people are underplaying what is going on, not exaggerating what is going on.
I think that's 100% accurate. And our frustration is that we can't get the information. They keep blacking out the region. So we hear from, families and people on the ground, but we can't get comprehensive information because Eritrean soldiers are blocking access. So what we're hearing really is mostly things that are happening in the city. We don't even know, as you go out into the countries, what the real numbers are. And every doctor who I've spoken to, the CEO of Eider Hospital, various medical professionals are saying exactly what you're saying. Everything's underreported. The rape is underreported. They say it's easily in the tens of thousands, in terms of how many women.
Let me say to you, in my experience as a physician, and having worked in many war zones around the world over the last nearly 40 years, I would say, now almost, never in my experience, and by the way, not just in conflicts, but also in my normal past medical practice, women never over-report. Because of the stigmatizing effect of sexual violence and rape, if there is anything we can say about this is that women constantly under-report what happens to them. And I saw this in my own eyes, for example, in Goma and in Bukavu, during the Rwanda genocide. And I saw this with my own eyes when I was touring some of the camps in South Sudan when I was still the UN resident coordinator. So in other words, the many women actually do not present themselves for healthcare, either because they don't have access to the healthcare or because they don't want to admit what's happened to them. So if you put all that together with what we know about the sexual violence in war situations, plus sexual violence in genocidal situations, you can be sure this is an epidemic of extraordinary and enormous proportions of what is going on in Tigray. So you understand when I say this is generation shifting, because what happens is this then becomes, sexual violence is a war on minds and hearts. Every society in the world, north, south, west and east, the sexuality of the women is a matter of that culture's sacredness, if you like. It doesn't matter whether you're a feminist or a modern person or whatever you are. Sexuality of women has a special role in all societies. Okay? So one way to assault that society is to humiliate that society. So you humiliate the men of that society by saying to them, you're not a man anymore. You can't even protect your wife. You can't protect your daughter. You can't protect your mother. You can't, for God's sake, protect your grandmother or your granddaughter. Right? You're not a man. You are just a second, someone who is kind of less than a man. It's de-manning, which is an aspect of dehumanization, which is a fundamental feature of genocide. So that's on the male side. On the female side, what it is doing is it is destroying their actual essence by destroying a woman's fertility and by destroying a woman's sense of themselves. You're effectively shifting, in a sense, the ability of that group of people, men and women, to actually reproduce themselves mentally, emotionally. And I'm not talking about births. I'm here talking about something much more important, much of greater significance than that. Now, the good news, however, is this. Well, I can't call it good news. There is no good news in this sorry story. But a small bit of encouragement is that women, I have observed time and time again, in situations ranging from the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh, which I went to see only very recently, or to the other communities of raped women that I've had access to or gone to see in Bosnia, for example, and certainly in other places, Rwanda and that were already mentioned, is that actually women, even they have been traumatized, raped, brutally assaulted, and dehumanized in this way, they are actually quite resilient. Let us not misuse the word resilient. That doesn't mean to say all will be well and we can just pick up the pieces and go forward. I don't want to sound trite like that. What I mean to say is that in order to resist this evil, in order to resist the completion of this genocidal project in Tigray, it is important for the men and women of Tigray, humiliated they may be, assaulted they may be, traumatized they certainly are, displaced as they are, hungry and starving as they may be, they must resist. And they must resist in their minds, in their emotions, in their bodies if they survive. But most importantly, they have to keep a sense of themselves. You know, when those who commit these acts of extreme sexual violence, what they're doing is they're actually demanning the perpetrators, because real men don't rape. So the Ethiopian soldiers and the Eritrean soldiers who are going around committing mass rape on Tigrayan women, they are cowards. They are too afraid. What they're doing is they're conducting their war to the defenseless bodies of women who cannot fight back. So Ethiopian men who are doing this, Eritrean men who are doing this, and the leaders who are cajoling to do this, political leaders as well as military leaders, they are the worst cowards on the universe. They should be ashamed of themselves because they're not real men.
Absolutely. And we know this is an order from the top because it's happening systemically throughout. And they've said it. The soldiers have said that to women. You have said every genocide has a signature, and the signature in Tigray is the sexual violence. That's a powerful statement.
Yes. I think, again, having been unfortunate to, in a sense, have a epidemiological and public health background, where you are trained to study symptoms of diseases, and from that you diagnose the actual disease. And so what you do is you begin to study patterns. And with diseases, you begin to recognize certain signatures of bacteria, of viruses, or certain forms of diseases that allows you to say, oh, this to me sounds like the coronavirus. This to me sounds like heart disease, whatever it is. So when you look at the pattern of what is going on in Tigray, there is a signature to it. There are many elements to it, and those have all been well discussed. But within the noise of the pattern, because in the middle of atrocities like this, there is a lot of noise. There is a lot of thunder and lightning, of confusion, of chaos. And of course, all of that is contrived, because the more confusion and noise and chaos you can create, the more you can hide underneath it in order to complete your work, if you like. So it's important to detect the signature, if you like, you see. And when you analyze the evidence in data, you understand that what is going on in the case of Tigray will be defined by the sexual violence that is going on there. That's what I mean, that the hallmark or the signature of the Tigray violence is going to be is sexual violence.
Wow, this is a really compelling interview. Thank you. I want to ask. We know that financial sanctions have been announced now. Visa sanctions have been announced. You've criticized a lot of countries for their lackluster response. I want to quote you. You said, Denmark's response is equivalent to Pontius Pilate wringing his hands while presiding over the crucifixion of Jesus. That's a damning statement. The Pope of Ethiopia has called this a genocide, and they put him on lockdown now. What do you say about the world's tepid response? I mean, I think Tigrayans have an opinion about this, but is it true that no genocide has ever been stopped without external military intervention? Is that what's needed at this point? And how do we get there? Those are big questions.
Yes. I mean, I'm afraid if you look at the history of genocide since the word was invented, not a single genocide has ever been stopped except through the application of countervailing force. Now, and that force obviously has to be either from outside, which was the case in Cambodia. It was the case in Rwanda, where though it was the Rwandans themselves who stopped it, they came in from outside, from Uganda in this particular case, or of course in the case of NATO in Srebrenica. Now, obviously, one could argue that genocide prevented or stopped, we wouldn't call it genocide. We wouldn't be calling genocide, so we don't know what was stopped and what prevented. But the point is that actually you are hard-pressed to define a single incident of massive crimes against humanity of a genocidal proportion that's ever been stopped. That is why I think a military intervention would certainly be needed. Now, in the case of Darfur, what happened was that after whatever I could do, and the Security Council intervened, the UN had to send in peacekeepers, which were under that section of the UN chapter 7, which meant there was an enforcement action. I'm afraid that's not going to happen simply because of China's position particularly, but also that of Russia. Probably we could get around Russia, but I can't see how we can get around China, which at the moment is on its own crusades, of course, inflicting genocide against the Uyghurs in its own territory. Now, my point here I'm trying to make is, yes, I'm very sorry that I think this is going to need some kind of military solution as a countervailing thing. But I can't see this happening from UN peacekeeping. Now, I am a peace lover. I mean, I don't want to. I am not in any sense condoning violence or armed violence by anybody or on anybody else. I'm just reflecting, in a sense, a study of history and my own direct observations, having been an actor in that history over 30, 40 years. So what that means is that if the Tigrayans and their friends seek to continue to resist so that the genocide against their people is not completed, I, for one, and I speak as a graduate of genocide because I was the United Nations chief in Darfur, and the genocide happened on my watch. That's why I say that my life is essentially a life of failure, because as the head of the United Nations, I could not stop the genocide in Darfur. Therefore, it is not for me to preach to the people of Tigray. If they wish to resist in whatever way they want to stop a genocide being completed in Tigray, in the same way that when the genocide in Rwanda started and everyone left, including the United Nations, it is not the job of the United Nations, having lost all moral authority and credibility by their late actions in every single genocide in history, and especially the non-action and anti-action in the case of Rwanda, the last genocide of the last century. It is not under any authority. They are not under any authority to say that the people of Tigray, when they have an existentialist threat against their lives, they cannot do whatever is necessary to defend themselves. In international law, there is a right of defense that when people are so threatened that their very existence on the planet is at risk because they are being annihilated. There is a case in international law and international customary law and to have the right to defense and to have the right to do everything that is necessary to save yourself. In fact, some would say it is a moral duty to so do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I have to address, you said a life of failure because of what happened in Darfur, but you have been a leading voice and a champion for so many individuals, including the people of Tigray now. So I have to counter that, that narrative of yourself. One thing I know for sure is the world is asking Ethiopia to stop killing Tigrayans. Please get rid of the Eritreans. The Ethiopian state is party to the genocide. You've already pointed that out, the massive organization that is required to pull off a genocide. So this won't work. This won't work if we're begging the person who is, one of the actors to stop. That's just not going to happen. We know Jeffrey Feltman is currently in the Horn again, and we eagerly, await for him to come back and hear what the next steps are. But I just don't think I agree with you in that without military intervention, I just don't see how this will end. And the people of Tigray can't stop fighting. As a matter of fact, the stories that we hear is that more and more young people are being forced to go out and join the fighters, because if they don't, they're arrested and abused. And like you said, they're watching their mothers being raped and their daughters being raped. So it's an impossible scenario for the people right now. Just today, the government, Abiy's office, the prime minister's office, had a press conference. And I think it was the first one really in several months, where Bilen, his spokeswoman, said that the West is patronizing, belligerent, and destructive in how it's talking about the war on Tigray. What do you think about that? This notion that so many Ethiopians, obviously non-Tigrayans, are denying what's happening. How can they stop it if they won't even acknowledge that it's happening, which we know is a part of genocide denial? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I'm not surprised if the Ethiopian leadership is saying these kind of things. I mean, this is a kind of horror movie being enacted out there, right? And the actors that are on one side of this horror movie in this massive plot of crime, if look upon it like that, naturally they're playing their part. Naturally, they're saying those kinds of things. And naturally, we also know that in a horror movie of this sort, there are also actors who are bystanders. And all through history, we have that. And then you have, that's why I was so angry against, and why I tweeted against, banal tweets by the likes of Denmark calling for humanitarian ceasefires, if you like, because calling for humanitarian ceasefire is first saying that as if humanitarian action has a solution, is a solution to this thing. And secondly, what a ceasefire means is, okay, stop doing something today and tomorrow. And by the way, once a little bit of aid has gone through, you can resume what you're doing tomorrow. My other point I want to make in relation to all this is, and Ethiopia should beware. Ethiopians should beware. And this is Ethiopians of all so-called ethnic groups. And as you know, ethnicity is an artificial construction. Humans are divided into ethnic groups not because of some law of nature. It is because it's a self-construction. Anyway, Ethiopians of all groups and all parts of the country should beware, because the other lesson from mass atrocities and genocidal crimes in other countries is that they may start in one place, but eventually they envelop a whole nation. So we're already seeing now what is going on in Ethiopia against a background of historic brutalities that preceded what is going on currently in Tigray, and despotic regimes lasting decades, if you like, is that instability spreads. Tit for tat crimes happen. And people, when they have lost any sense of balance, because these types of crimes against humanity have infectious properties, they're a bit like a disease that spreads. Call it, if you like, a form of virus. The whole country is struck. So what I would say to Abiy and others is, watch out. What you're doing is you're presiding over the destruction of the whole country. Because the situation in Tigray is not going to be resolved by a ceasefire. It is not going to be resolved by letting through a few grains of wheat. It is not going to be resolved by trying to annihilate a people in the way that they are. Because the other lesson from history is that genocides actually, ultimately don't work. Even though the genocidal journey is annihilation work, actually, if you look back, the Jews of Europe didn't get annihilated in the end. What happened was that what started in Germany spread to the whole of Europe, and it brought the whole world to war. What is starting in Tigray is already enveloping Ethiopia. It is already enveloping its neighbors in some ways. And in time, it will go beyond the Horn of Africa. That is the nature of genocide. And I think the government of Ethiopia is quite stupid in this regard. I would say, if, for example, you were going to do a military campaign in order to solve a particular problem of insurgency in an area, I, who am not a military man at all, but I've observed many military campaigns and have been alongside many military operations around the world, it was the most dumbest strategy that Addis government could do in terms of what they're trying to do in Tigray. All I can say is that Abiy and the people around him, both military and others, are the dumbest leaders that I have come across. So because if they were smarter, they could have achieved what they wanted without getting to the situation now where they have brought a country which was a rising hope of Africa and the world, which had risen out of the ashes of decades of misgovernance and turned the corner, not turning the corner, it had turned the corner. It's now going back not just to the status quo ante, but to a new dark ages and a new hole that is going to sink not just the country and all its peoples, but also its neighborhoods and beyond. And this is why the Amhara, the Amoro, and God knows all the many ethnic groups in Ethiopia that you know about, and that I've understood a little bit more as I got involved in this, is they are being stupid. As someone said once somewhere else, first they came for the Jews, then they came for the intellectuals, and then they came for the teachers, and so on and so forth, and then they came for you. So Mark my words, this is just the opening chapter of what is a great evil that is going to stalk the land for a long time to come, unless things are rapidly reversed. I'm not optimistic. I'm not optimistic there will be. However, I'm optimistic that the people of Tigray will survive. They will resist in whatever way they wish. And in time, history will rectify itself. The only question is how much suffering will have to be attended, how much brutality and inhumanity must be experienced, before that happens.
Well, and it's too much. It's too much. But I want to quote you. You said genocides don't work. And I think that's a very powerful statement. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kapila. Thank you. Tigray cannot wait. The costs are very high. The direct costs and the indirect costs are very high. Thank you for your time. Thank you for what you're doing. We hope you'll come back again and give us an update as this progresses. And I just hope that a lot of what you said today was very insightful, including the information about Gambia. I think that is a strategy. I don't think that we're pushing hard enough, individuals who are trying to stop the genocide. So thank you. I'll give you the last word if there's anything else that you'd like to say.
Yes, if I may. Well, one is again, a message to the people of Tigray: don't give up. This is not saying to you fight and retaliate. I'm just saying don't give up. And remain of stout heart and good minds, and behave in a sensible way and resist. Because in the end, I think truth will prevail. My second message is for the people of Ethiopia as a whole. Please come to your senses as a whole and bring your government to your senses. The final solution will only be when the people of the whole of Ethiopia come to their senses, if you like. My third message is for the world. And that is to say that as we look around the globe with many, many bad things happening in many, many different places, it is the solidarity that is needed amongst all the oppressed peoples of the world. In the way that WHO talks about the solidarity in terms of the coronavirus and vaccination, we need solidarity amongst oppressed peoples, wherever they are in the world. Because when things happen, when crimes against humanity happen in one place, they are a crime against humanity in all places. It is, but don't forget, there are billions of good people in the world. By and large, of the 7+ billion population in the world, the majority are good people. That is why, on balance, if you take the long arc of history, the arc of good is higher than the arc of evil, even though it may not feel like it when you're sitting in Tigray or somewhere else where all these horrible things are going on. And therefore, that solidarity of the oppressed, that arc of goodness and resistance against common inhumanity is, I think, the tools for mobilizing the world as a whole, regardless of whether the Security Council is paralyzed, regardless of whether the archaic legal processes of international law get down to it or don't get down to it sooner than later. So I think that's what we've got to hold on to it in the period ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. To the people of Tigray, be strong. To the people of Ethiopia, come to your senses. To the world, solidarity is needed. Thank you, Mr. Mukesh Kapila, arguably the most authoritative voice on genocide and a global humanitarian. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.